So I get a phone call and it's a buddy, friend, colleague. He's a trainer, known him for years, over 10. Worked with a lot of people in his family. And I'm speaking in with this particular tone because very quickly in that conversation, you knew it was going to be one of those conversations in terms of the severity. And very quickly, he alluded to an upcoming open heart procedure that he was going to have. He had some questions, not necessarily the quality of the diagnosis, but it turns out that everything he was saying made sense. But what could or should he be doing or not doing from a training aspect, not necessarily to reverse the situation, but to continue to even just go into that procedure as elite as possible. So there's an entire cascade of overall health and fitness and wellness that certainly can even speak to the anesthesia that is involved in a type of surgery. Not really going to get into that, but we can talk a little bit about the central cardiovascular components that this particular situation where there's valve issue, regurgitation, again, the specifics actually don't matter. What matters is that when there's this level of diagnosis that does qualify through echo, and I said, did you get an echo? Because before we start saying we think these things, we go by what you say, what you do, and the truth. So that's why imaging, in this case, an echo, we can hypothesize, we can surmise that we think there's some cardiac myohypertrophy. However, we don't know that, but we have a way to look, and that's through an echo. So it turns out that when the chambers, any of the chambers of the heart, we've typically talked about the left ventricle quite a bit. This is one of the different ventricles, but any point, if a ventricle has to work harder to get the same amount out, we're running into all these same ejection fraction issues. And there's an efficiency component to that then just runs a cascade of everything else. So my advice was, number one, we should be double and triple checking all of this information on, because I'm only getting what I'm told. And there's a lot of other factors that could be considered when we make some of these decisions. I also suggested that any type of professional, whether it be physical therapist, whether it be cardiologist or a cardiothoracic surgeon, those individuals that are really, really good at one thing may not always be good or recognize the need for other things. AKA, a cardiologist who's really, really good at diagnosing cardiac pathology may not have any idea on what are the better or worse fitness choices that you should be making when you do have cardiac myohypertrophy. Where are we going with this? When you have to work harder to get the blood into the next chamber or out through the aorta, then your top end will be compromised. So I said we should probably be very considerate of keeping total heart rates low. And as we get higher, then we are running the risk of not having enough oxygen in blood because the blood is not getting out at this exceedingly high amount. Now, if you're working really, really hard, then the working tissue requires blood. And in the blood is a bunch of stuff like oxygen. So if there's not going to be enough, the blood that comes out is also partitioned through the coronary arteries. And those are the ones that feed the working tissue called the heart. So if at some point there's not enough oxygen getting to the heart because it has to work so hard to work in conjunction with other muscles, we have a major concern here. So I said, and then we started to talk. He's like, yeah, like forever, I've never really been able to get my heart rate over 165. I said, I don't know if that is the case because ironically, I have gotten my heart rate over 165 and I have no cardiac markers. I've had echoes, not because I couldn't get my heart rate over 165, but that makes sense because then again, not getting into the specifics, but obviously the vagus nerve is then going to react to whatever this environment is and whatever these other markers are and keep heart rate lower so that you don't get into this bad situation. You stay kicking. Now, the next part of our discussion was, and that relates to cardio. That relates, or like what we're calling cardio, what we call conditioning, what we call cyclic repeats. I say just keep it lower, and obviously there's other benefits that can happen there. Peripheral vascularization. Okay, so how do you do more with less in terms of this getting the blood to the working tissues as a central mechanism? So, good news. Now, what I was about to get into is, what about lifting? The conversation shifted to that. And I said, right now, my suggestion is that it doesn't matter how your heart rate gets high. What matters is that it's getting into a place where we are knowingly not getting this high ejection fraction I can't suggest that we should even be under these immediate, transient, quick hits of super high blood pressure and heart rate from a heavy deadlift. You still need to feed the tissues that are working to get you, even though it's not there for a long time. So you could, in theory, say, okay, well, just getting into these, highly, challenging cardiac environments is not as risky as doing it over a long period of time. I think it was still something to consider. So I think we can move with weights. I don't know that we should be lifting the weights that would demand these types of possible environments that we know we're not showing up with full forces. So it doesn't mean you don't lift. It just means we should maybe take some considerations, because even though we know that the heart rate and the demands of legitimate resistance training is entirely different than creating adaptations in the central components of the cardiovascular system. We know those are two different things. Like you can't get all the cardio adaptations just from lifting. It's not how it works. Well, my heart rate is up to this high, and look, it's kept it there. Dude, it's because you didn't get it there from the same way. Like it's just, they're not it. That wasn't part of our discussion. But again, I always try to use these different, whether it's case studies or these recounts, to see like how all this information, bang, like now it's real. Now it's real. This isn't somebody who wants to pull big wheels. I'll tell you a little bit about this somebody, which is really also something that he chose to talk to me. This is a former professional athlete. He's been there and done that. Looked up at the lights, even had a speaking voice on Saturday night. Coming from a family, a particular culture where men aren't supposed to have these types of conversations. And he'll be fine, because of whatever is going on. He's not the only person in the world to have these types of valve issues. So not only was this post about seeing how a lot of the stuff that we talk about from performance and rehab, it can be really, really meaningful, because if someone doesn't have that information, they go one direction. And usually when we're getting from a traditional healthcare situation where we're staring at mortality, they don't know about these other things. And we know that, and that's okay. And as long as they admit they don't know it or don't start to go wild, because remember, from their perspective, guarantee nothing happens if you don't try. That's how people stay alive. That's not how you're optimal. That's not how you're enjoying your life within at least an educated, if not intelligent, risk reward. So we got that part. But also, to be trusted and to be recognized and to have a real conversation is not something that happens a lot for me. And I'm very, very thankful where the vulnerability, the transparency of somebody who, I don't mean physically, but he's a big boy. He's going to be fine. And this might have just been a need to talk to somebody, and I'm glad that I could be that person. When I say he's a big boy, he's not as big as the dude he bumped into when he tore his ACL. So only he'll know that if he's even watching this, that inside line. But I hope at some point, whether it's your children or somebody looks to you to have that kind of conversation, because you have become someone that they truly look to, if not look up to. And I'm glad I could use that as a way to shield what I really wanted to say with some of these very, very useful, very, very important scientific concepts as it relates to the central mechanisms of cardiovascular, in this case, highly pathological, but also some of these social things that you just don't see it. Like people just don't talk. They don't want to be transparent. I've had very difficult conversations. Instead of not saying anything, or instead of dancing around what you're really not saying, you would have just been, I probably would have felt better in that conversation if you just told me to fuck off. Knowing what makes the other person tick a little bit can take conversations a long way, so that you can play a whole bunch of different characters in this really cool movie.